So in January of 2011, some crazy, freakish light comes down out of the sky, hovers over the Temple Mount, and then shoots up into the sky. It was late at night. There's 4 different camera angles. Not a lot of people were awake at that time, and it's on the weather cam as well. And that time sort of freaked a bunch of people out, and they began looking at it, and scientists began to study it and trying to figure out, is this legit or is this real? 2 of the cameras were actually a group of people from the same party. 2 of the other cameras were from elsewhere, and of course then you had the weather cam. And as the scientists looked at it, they said, well, we're not sure this is real because, for one, nobody stepped forward to make money off of this. Doesn't sound very scientific to me, and that's an American way of thinking, but oh well. So they said that. They also said they couldn't find the original people who posted these. And then one guy studied them, claiming that he thinks there's some playing with the videos, playing with the software that would make it fake, but at the same time it was also seen on the weather cam, which didn't make a ton of sense. And then he also said the object was way too small to be a spacecraft. It was only about 15 feet tall. And if you look at it, he says the light of it doesn't shine on the dome of the rock, which it hovered over. And so therefore it could not have been a UFO, a space alien ship, is their conclusion. What if it was an angelic being? I don't know if you know this, but strange, crazy, mysterious lights over the Temple Mount, this is not a first time. It has happened before. For those of you who spent time reading your Bibles, you would know that the whole idea of the temple was borrowed from Moses' tabernacle, and light hovered over the tabernacle the whole time the Jews wandered in the wilderness, the whole time. And then you would see that when Solomon dedicated the temple, light came down out of heaven, hovered over that thing, smoke and billows and clouds and lightning drove everybody out. Not even the priests could enter the temple. And then Ezekiel, several hundred years later, in a vision, he sees the light move up out of the temple, over on top of the temple doorposts, out to the eastern gate, up to the Mount of Olives, and poosh, up into heaven. He saw the light leave the temple, and you know what happened next? The Babylonians destroyed the temple. And so I don't know if you know this, but light hovering over the temple, in the Temple Mount, God's sacred space on earth, let's call it, is not unusual. It's happened before in history. And when it does, it's usually a big sign. In this case, I thought, well, if that was 2011, what in the world happened in 2011? And later that year in Israel in 2011, there was this massive unification of the people. Millions of people began to protest. Hundreds of thousands of them turned out, and they actually did almost a complete overhaul of their governmental system and how their economic system worked in 2011. There was this major shift and change in Israeli society where the middle class people said, this isn't working for us anymore, and it actually turned the entire economy around. Now, since I read the Bible a lot, I know one other thing too. The fact that that light left and went back up into the sky, I would say not a good sign. If it hovered and stayed, I'd be like, okay, that's a good sign. When the light leaves, in history, that's been a bad sign. In fact, there were a couple times in history that we don't even know about unless you do a lot of really super steep study because they're not recorded in the Bible, when the light appeared and it was a bad sign when it left. I've been studying through end times in Matthew chapter 24. I don't really do a lot of end time stuff. People get all goo-goo gaga about it. I find when people first come to Christ, they get really excited about the end time stuff and the Bible prophecy and all that. It's tended to be something that I've watched over the years and read a ton of stuff over the years. But we're studying through the Gospel of Matthew. And when you hit chapter 24, you can't avoid it. And so I did a sermon on not one stone left upon another, which Jesus talked about how the temple would be destroyed and signs of the end times. And then last week, Josh Schultz did a sermon on the whole sheep and the goats judgment, which kind of occurs within that whole context of Jesus giving the same speech about end times. And so I wanted to shift gears a little bit today and talk about Luke chapter 21, which is called a parallel passage. In the Gospel of Luke, it tells the exact same story as what's said in Matthew 24. And there's some stuff in Luke that I think is really odd and interesting and would teach us something about end times. If Jesus taught us to be on the lookout for the end times and what's going to happen in it, then we should be on the lookout for it. We should pay attention to what Jesus said. So if you got a Bible, you can turn to Luke 21. I think I may have put this passage on the slide. And let me see if it works. I didn't get a chance to test this morning because stuff was going on. Oh, let me turn it on first and let me see what I got. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, there's the protests that were in Israel. And here we go, Luke chapter 21. Jesus talking, same thing. He says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is near." In the Matthew 24 passage, what he actually said is, when you see the abomination of desolation, know that its time to end is near. So now Luke is kind of clarifying it. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So Jesus in this little passage clearly gives a very clear description to his people that Jerusalem's going to fall. It's going to be very, very bad. It's going to be dark and ugly. There's going to be death and mayhem. And if you see this sign of the armies coming to surround Jerusalem, my followers, Jesus saying, get out as fast as you can, don't look back. And then he said, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles, meaning Israel, the Jewish people, are going to lose control of their Temple Mount, of their city, of their holiest place on earth. They're going to lose it, and the Gentiles will run it, and the Gentiles will be in charge of it until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, which, let's face it, we're still living in them. Because the Romans took it, and then the Byzantines took it, and then along came the Arabs, and they took it, and then the Crusaders took it, and then the Saracens took it back, and then the Ottoman Turks took it from them, and then on it goes. And guess who's never had it in 2,000 years? The Jews. They've never had it. Different Gentile groups have ruled over it. And even to this day, although the Jewish people control the Temple Mount, they're not actually in control. The Arab world is still in control of the Temple Mount. And here's what gets me, though. The very next thing Jesus says, exact same section, he says this, going on. And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth, distress of nations, with perplexity or confusion, the seas and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads because your redemption draws near. Okay, so here's the thing I'm looking at. Clearly, in this section, Jesus is talking about the very end of time when he returns. When the Son of Man, which is his favorite title for himself, he uses that more than any other title for himself in the New Testament. When you see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with great glory, guess what did not happen when the Romans conquered Jerusalem? Jesus didn't come in a great cloud and glory. He didn't show up. And all this stuff about the signs in the heavens and things, so it's like what's happening is Jesus is like jumping in history. In the same paragraph, he's talking about the end of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the Jewish people, the time of the Gentiles, and then without skipping a beat, even throwing the word and there will be signs, he jumps to the end of time. I don't get the connection. I don't understand the connection until I really look at it. And a couple of weeks back, I did this little talk about Seattle. And I said, this is the view of Seattle from Queen Anne Hill. I don't know if you've ever been up on Queen Anne Hill and looked at Seattle, but you can describe it, can't you? You can see the skyline, you see the Space Needle, you see Mount Rainier in the background. And if I asked you to describe this, you could describe everything that you see. And I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, what's interesting is from Queen Anne Hill, you could walk to the Space Needle. You don't even need to drive there. It's close enough to walk down to it. Mount Rainier is 2 hours drive away. If you got in a car, you could drive for 2 hours, you could get to the base of Mount Rainier, you wouldn't even be on the top of it. In fact, you wouldn't even be climbing it yet. And I mention it, sometimes this is what you see in Bible prophecy, that what they see is the whole thing beginning to end. What the person who's writing can't see is the gap, the distance between events. So sometimes a prophet will be describing an event that'll happen right there in their time, very soon, very close, and they'll see the big picture, but they don't understand the distance in the big picture. I think this is one of those passages when Jesus talks, he's both describing the Space Needle, when Jerusalem will be destroyed, and he's also describing Mount Rainier, when he returns again. And what Matthew, what Luke, what Peter don't understand is the gap of distance in time between those things. And so, as I was looking at this and reading, now I had my knee replaced this summer, so I was out for a long time, as many of you know. While I was out, I decided to pick up my Josephus copy again and begin doing some more reading. And he was an ancient historian who actually lived during the time of the destruction of the temple. He originally fought against the Romans. He lost, his city was captured, but he did such a good job fighting that Vespasian, who was conquering him, said, I kind of need to talk to you because you're too smart. And he brought him on, and so he actually hung out with Vespasian. For the rest of the war, he was in Vespasian's camp. And after Jerusalem fell, he wrote this entire history of the Jewish people. So if you read his book, it's all of the Old Testament, all of the time between the Testaments, and all of the time, what we would call New Testament times leading to the destruction of Jerusalem. It is a long read. So I was up to reading the second half of the Jewish Wars. And here's something that he said interesting about the Jewish wars. So just before Rome came and conquered Jerusalem, and this would be 30 years after Jesus said what he just said, what we read in Luke. He says, Josephus says this, the year before the Romans came, a star resembling a sword stood over the city. A comet lasted for an entire year, and at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at 3 a.m., a light shone around the temple, bright as day for half an hour. He also mentions that the eastern gate of the inner temple court was made of brass and vastly heavy, taking 20 men to close, and it was bolted to the floor with a large stone. It opened of its own accord at midnight, and it could only be shut again with great difficulty. This was at the Passover feast the year before it would fall. The light appeared over the temple again. And he says this is an actual quote from Josephus. He says, this also appeared to the vulgar to be a very happy prodigy, as if God did thereby open the gate of happiness. But the men of learning understood it, and that the security of their holy house was dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate was open for the advantage of their enemies. So these publicly declared that the signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Besides these, a few days after the feast, on the 1 and the 20th day of the month of Artemis, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surroundings of the cities. Moreover, at the feast which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that in the first place they felt a quaking and heard a great noise, and after that they heard the sound as of a great multitude saying, let us remove hence. Let's get out of here. So the signs and the wonders were already occurring in that. Now I'm reading through this thing, and I'm reading what is said in Luke, and I'm looking at this fall of the Israel or Jerusalem to the Romans, and kind of thinking about the end times and all that, and trying to figure out the connection. And the more I read, the more I thought, it seems to me that what Jesus is saying is, pay attention to whatever happened then, because whatever happened then, back when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, is also going to be what it's like just before he comes. Wouldn't that make sense? It's like this parallel. He's saying, beware, it's going to be like this when Jerusalem falls. And then he shifts gears so fast to his second coming that all I can conclude is when he comes again, whatever that was like is what it's going to be like at the end. And so I decided to go back and read. Now, I don't know, you guys have all probably heard the Romans conquered, Jerusalem. And probably what you understand, the way I've always understood it too, is that the Jews got together, they banded together and united and tried to overthrow the Romans, and they lost. And then Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and it's been that way since. That's kind of how I understood it. But when I went back and read the story, it's like, oh, that's not really the true story. And in fact, whatever that story is, it's relevant today because that Temple Mount is still the site where World War III could get started if things go bad. And so I look and I read, and I said, well, here's the thing. I thought, one time in my life, I ought to tell the story of the fall of Jerusalem. And I'm never going to tell this again, so you're kind of lucky today. But it's going to be hardcore history, right? You're going to hear the story of how Jerusalem fell. And when I read the whole story, I'm like, oh my God, it was awful. Not only was it awful, it was colossally stupid. And so I think in the end times, in the last days before Jesus comes back, will it be as colossally awful and as hideously stupid as it was back then? See, to understand the whole story, you kind of got to go back. Jesus was not accepted by the Jews. When he was crucified, that was their way of rejecting the Messiah, saying, we don't want you, you're out here. He had told them, you won't see me again until you say, blessed is you comes in the name of the Lord, which is a messianic title. He goes, until the Jews are looking for the Messiah again, they're not going to see the Messiah. He's crucified, and he warned them, not one stone will be left upon another. Judgment is going to fall on this nation for what is happening here. And, of course, he launches the church, and the church should have been accepted by the Jewish people who had all the history and all the understanding of the scriptures, but instead they reject and they persecute the church. They kill the apostles, and by the 50s AD, persecution is running so rampant that most of the Christians actually leave Jerusalem. Only a handful of Christians, and they're the great apostles, are still hanging out in the 50s AD. And then, of course, in 64 AD, Rome burns, Nero's fiddling, and then after Rome burns, he blames the Christians because it's suddenly like there needed to be a scapegoat. Who caused this? And so he blames Christians, and Christians are thrown to the lions and that kind of thing. What made them suspicious is as soon as Rome had finished burning and all the vast quantities of this whole neighborhoods were burnt down, he magically had architectural plans for a whole new city, which fit that space. Right? There he was, and included a giant palace for him. Made him very suspicious. Anyway, so he had to blame the Christians. And so the Christians are already scattered throughout. There's this whole shift of Christianity. Is no longer the center. It's not Jerusalem. It is moved to the city of Antioch. It's spreading across Europe. It's going everywhere. So Jerusalem is not the hotbed of Christianity. It's actually still the hotbed of Judaism. And while all this is going on, and we're reading our New Testament about these stories of the Apostle Paul and these great miracles that he's doing, while that's going on, what was going on in Jerusalem? In Jerusalem, a bunch of zealots, people who wanted to overthrow the Roman government, were getting stronger and stronger and more powerful. And out of this group of zealots, they suddenly decided that if you weren't fully on their side, then you were an equal enemy as if you were Roman. And so they started to hide daggers inside their coats and inside the sleeves, and these guys were called the Sicarii, meaning long knives. And they would walk through the crowd, and at any festival, they would stab and murder anyone that disagreed with them. And they began murdering people all over Jerusalem all the time. These assassins, they killed quietly in the daytime, in the crowded markets, and in the streets. And then sometimes they would stab a guy, and then slip the knife up and go, oh my God, my friend's been stabbed. Help, somebody help me, right? And they're the one who did it. And so they began, and of course it made it that there was this fear going on throughout Jerusalem of who's going to stab me. Guys didn't even want to hang out with their own friends. And this is going on. And so this is happening. So this whole zealot thing is happening, and there's this whole shifting gears where if you weren't on the Jewish side and you were a Jewish person, another Jew might kill you. This is going on in Jerusalem. At the same time, there's this Egyptian guy who comes on the scene, claims to be the Messiah, and he raises up an army of 30,000 people who want to overthrow the Romans. They march to the Mount of Olives, and Felix, the governor, who we can read about in our New Testament, he sends an army out there. They destroy most of them. They take a bunch of others captive, sell them into slavery, but thousands of them escape. And of the thousands that escape, they go into the rural areas, they go into the villages, and they begin to plunder and loot and sort of become this wild army that can't be put down. And everyone is afraid. Everyone's having these troubles. They plundered the houses of the great men. They slew men themselves. They set villages on fire. Judea was filled with the effects of their madness, Josephus says. This is what's going on in Jerusalem while the Apostle Paul and Peter are out there preaching. And so what's happening is this crazy madness is taking them over. Now, there's a series of governors that we could read about. First guy, we know about Pontius Pilate. He's the one that crucified Jesus. And then there were 5 others, different governors that the Roman emperor would put in charge. Each lasted only about a year. And then Felix comes in. We know about him because he's in our book of Acts, as is Festus. Those guys are also mentioned in the book of Acts. And then there's this guy who is super corrupt called Albinus. He's made governor. And then they put a guy named Gessius Florus in charge. He becomes the new governor of Judea. He is so corrupt that Josephus says he makes Albinus look like a saint. His corruption was awful. He got his job because his wife was good friends with Nero's girlfriend. And so that's how he gets the job. And you're like, I'm in. I mean, nothing's going to happen to me because my wife and Nero's girlfriend, they're good pals. So anything I do here, anything goes wrong, if it gets Nero's attention, I'm just going to have the girls talk about it and I'll be fine. And he arrives in Judea and he hates Jews, absolutely hates them. And so he's acting in a way that just, he wants to wipe them out. He's corrupt as all get out. He's trying to get money off of as many people as he can. He perverts all the laws that he could get as much money as he can. He starts fining people. He's not enough to just fine an individual. He will fine an entire guild or whole class of people so that he could just start having money flow into his own pockets. He actually lets gangs of thieves operate freely across Judea, robbing anyone they want, killing anyone they want, doing anything they want, as long as they give him a cut. If he gets a cut, these gangs of thieves are turned loose. And so he's running Judea, but in the most corrupt possible manner. It's hideous. And so what's going on is there's the city. So he's got, at the time that just after Jesus, this would have been the city the way it looked. There's a lower city, the city of David, the lower city, and then you have the upper city, which is kind of in red. That's the hobnobby, snobby neighborhood. And then you have the new city, the new development that's out there. And you see the Temple Mount and the city that's around it. 3 or 4 successive series of walls, because every time they'd expand the city, they'd have to build a new wall. And then they'd expand the city and they'd build a new wall. So it's got 3 or 4 series of walls around it. And this is the city that he's kind of in charge of. Now, the interesting thing is that he's not in charge in Jerusalem. The Judean governors, they were all in charge in Caesarea, out there on the coast. That was their headquarters. A few times a year, they would go up to Jerusalem if there was a big festival or something. But by and large, they stayed out of Jerusalem. I'm going to go back one. They would have, you see the little towers that's on the corner of, it'd be the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. There's a couple of towers there. That's the Antonia Fortress. That's actually got Roman soldiers in it who are watching out. So he would come to the Antonia Fortress and hang out there. But by and large, all of the governors hung out in Caesarea. If there was a big festival, Pentecost, Yom Kippur, Passover, whatever, they would come to Jerusalem because that's where the crowds were. They wanted to keep things down. But they ruled from Caesarea. And then the whole region is developed into, like, there's Idumea. Judea is what the governor would run, or the procurator. And then you'd have Samaria, the Decapolis, Perea, Galilee. Those are all run by King Herod Agrippa II. And then you have Phoenicia, independent territory. And way north you'd have Syria. And in Syria, that's where the big dog was. The head of the whole region would be the Roman official, the governor who sat at Damascus. He's the big dog. And so everybody else somehow has to cater to him. In the chain of command, he's the highest in that whole region. And so as Florus is kind of leading this whole thing in corruption, there's a festival that happens in Jerusalem. And because the festival is so big that the leader in Syria, and his name is Cestius, he comes down and he's at the festival, and the Jews start complaining to him. They're like, dude, Florus is out of hand. You got to do something about him. You got to rein him in. He's corrupt. He's stealing from us. He's changing laws. He's taxing stuff. And the whole time they're complaining, Florus is standing right by Cestius laughing. And so when the festival ends, he and Cestius load up in a wagon. They head to Caesarea. And on the way, as they're going to Caesarea, Florus sweet talks Cestius the whole way. These Jews can't trust anything they have to say. don't listen to them. They're just mad because I'm keeping order, that kind of thing. Sweet talks them the whole way so they don't think anything of it. Cestius goes back to Caesarea, and Florus realizes, I'm in trouble. I mean, I've done some pretty bad things here, and the only way I'm going to get to hang on to all my money and all my stuff is if nobody brings charges against me to Nero. And that's probably going to happen. So the only way I'm going to make it is if I can get the Jews to revolt. If I can get the Jews to revolt, then I'm going to look like the good guy. I can keep all my money and all my stuff that I've taken up, and they'll look bad and I'll look good. So he actually sets out to force them to revolt. That's his new plan after this takes place. And so one of the things he does, there's this little battle between the Jews and the Greeks that's going on in Caesarea. They're fighting over where the synagogue's located, who's in charge of it. And the Jews are like, come on, you got to help us, man. We've been in this battle for a long time. This is going to turn into open warfare and bloodshed if you don't do something. And so he says, well, yeah, pay me and I'll fix the problem. So they pay him about $5 million. And instead of fixing the problem, he skips town and leaves them to their own. And then he heads up to the Temple Mount, and he decides, I'm going to take some soldiers, we're going to go to the temple, and we're going to take all the money that's in the treasury in the temple, which is about $20 million. Now, that's Jewish money raised by the Jewish people under Old Testament law. Each person had to donate a little bit every year, and all of that money is to be used for the temple and to improve the temple, and it's for the Jewish people. And he's going to raid it, and he's going to claim Nero wants it. Nero wants this money, so I'm coming up there to take it. They put up a little bit of a resistance, and there's a big fight that kind of happens. He's able to get his hands on the money anyway, but the fight doesn't make things any better. And so when they come out of there, now he's taken all the money out of the treasury, and he does this interesting thing. As this conflict is happening, he orders his soldiers to go to the marketplace of the upper city. Do you see that in red there? That is the Beverly Hills of Jerusalem at the time. Right? That's where the hobnobbies are. That's the powerful. That's the elite. That's where the rich live. They all live in the upper city. So he orders his soldiers, go to the upper city and kill whoever you want and take whatever you want. Go to their marketplace and do as much pillaging, plundering, and raping as you want. And so they do. And they pillage the upper city marketplace, and they start killing people left and right. They plundered and killed in the streets and house to house. They caught many regular people, brought them down to Florus. He set up this quickie tribunal where he was located, and he had many of them whipped and then crucified. That day, 3,600 men, women, little children, old people, infants were killed by the Roman soldiers that day. Right? Remember, he wants to cause a revolt. Now, the Jewish people are like, whoa. And on top of that, the people he had whipped and crucified who'd come out of that upper city, the powerful, the elite, the rich, many of them were Roman citizens, which meant it was totally illegal to whip them and certainly illegal to crucify them. And he crucified them. 3,600 people die that day. And of course, this creates quite the uproar. And so now there's this huge, and of course some of the other leaders like Agrippa and others are like, whoa, this cannot get out of hand. If this gets out of hand and Rome comes, we're doomed. So Agrippa's trying to settle things down, and some of the high priest is trying to calm things down. They're like, well, I know this is bad, but let's not let it get worse. This is a hideous day. What are we going to do? And they try to talk about, like, sooner or later he's going to go. Let's just bite our tongue. Let's hold on. Let's not do anything, right? And so there's this little calm negotiation that happens between the city leaders and Governor Florus. And he goes, okay, I'm not comfortable here, though. I'm bringing 2 more cohorts of soldiers up from Caesarea, which is about 1,000 men. And he says, and they're going to march up here, and they're going to come to Jerusalem. And if you guys are honest that you want peace, you're going to line the road outside the city. And as they're marching, you're going to sing their praises. You're going to give them compliments. You're going to cheer them. You're going to salute them. You're going to be happy that Roman soldiers are coming to your city. And that's how I want you to treat them. You treat them with respect, and you salute them, and you greet them, and you say nice things about them as they're coming to the city. Get out there and do that. Meanwhile, the message that he sends to the Roman cohort is, hey, they're going to say nice things. Do not respond. Be stone-faced. Don't give any acknowledgement that they're doing that. And then, if any of them start insulting you or doing anything that could be construed as attacking you, you're free to go after them. That's what he tells the Roman cohort. Of course, he knows these young, hot-headed zealots are in the crowd. He knows it's inevitable that if they're praising them, it's not going to last. And that's exactly what transpires. 1,000 Roman soldiers marching to Jerusalem. The road is lined with the Jewish people who are forced to go out there and greet them nicely after the soldiers just killed 3,600 of their people. And of course, they're not responding at all, and the young hotheads in the crowd start throwing insults instead. As soon as they do, all the Roman soldiers pull out their clubs and they start beating the crowd. The crowd flees to the gates, trying to get into the city, tramples each other in the crushing thing, and before it's all said and done, thousands more are killed. It's said that the soldiers clubbed hundreds of people to death. Many people were crushed trying to get into the city gate, and the bodies were so mangled, people couldn't even identify their relatives. Rome was a brutal nation, right? So Florus suddenly writes to Cestius. He writes a letter to Cestius up in Syria saying, the Jews are in revolt. They have revolted. What am I to do? Right? He's caused it. He's gotten what he's wanted. So Cestius sends a guy down to check it out, and he gets together with King Agrippa. They walk through the Jerusalem. They get the stories, and they're like, oh my God, what has Florus done? And they realize Florus is the problem. So they go back and they tell this to Cestius, but it ain't over yet. And Agrippa gives this long speech to the whole Jewish people. He stands up there at the temple and he gives this long speech saying, look, this has been horrible bad. It's gone from bad to worse, but we cannot let it get even worse. And he gives this whole story. If we try to fight, we will lose. And we will lose big time. He tries to calm everybody down and get this whole thing to change course, hoping it'll give us a chance to get rid of Florus. So that's what Agrippa does, but they don't listen to him. Meanwhile, there's this young guy up in the temple. His name's Eleazar. He's in the high priest line. He's the son of the high priest. He's actually the official caretaker of the temple. His job is to see to it that all the administration of the temple goes right. He's not a priest himself, but he's the caretaker of the temple. And he gets together with a bunch of the younger priests, and they say, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And they decide they will no longer take any money from foreigners. They will no longer offer any prayers for foreigners. They will no longer allow any sacrifices or prayers to be made on behalf of a foreigner, a Jew only, and they will not pay the tribute to Rome anymore after what has just happened. Not paying the tribute is an open declaration of war. That's saying we're revolting against you. So the old guy priests and the nobility try to get these young guys and say, whoa, well, that's a bad idea. Please don't do that because it's going to get even worse if we do that. But Eleazar and his group, and he's got a bunch of zealots in there with him, these young radicals who want to overthrow the Roman government. They're up there in the Temple Mount, and they're with the priests and everything. They will not listen. And the Temple Mount is like a fortress. And so once they're in there, they can't be stopped. They just bar the doors and say, we're in control. There's nothing you can do about it. So the nobility and Agrippa and the old guys, they write to Florus, or the old guys write to Agrippa and they write to Florus. And they send them a note. They tell both of them, please send troops up here to take the Temple Mount because it's in control of some radicals that we can't get rid of. And this is going from bad to worse because they're not going to pay the tribute. Florus reads the note and goes, got what I wanted. So he's not going to send anybody. Agrippa decides to send his Roman troops. They come in, and for 7 days, they're fighting between the upper city and the temple. 7 days, 7 nights, battles fighting. Roman soldiers on behalf of Agrippa and the Jews fighting the Jews in the temple who are the zealots. And so this is almost a Jew-on-Jew fight, except there's some Roman soldiers involved. And so they're having this whole thing go down, and there's 7 days of brutal fighting. At the end of the 7 days, lo and behold, a festival comes. So time out, no more fighting because we're at this festival. It's a once-a-year festival where everybody gathers wood. And they gather wood and bring it to the temple because there were sacrifices going on all the time in the temple. They had to have virtually an endless supply of wood. So there was a festival held where every year all the Jerusalem people would go out, gather wood, bring it back in, stock the temple up, and the day of that festival occurs. So there's a truce called between the two warring parties who've been fighting each other day and night for 7 days. And during the truce, all of the zealots that were up on the Temple Mount, they dress in regular outfits and they go out with their knives and they hang out amongst all the regular people gathering wood and they start knifing all of Agrippa's guys. They start killing them and assassinating them. And then by that time they can take over the city. So while the festival's going on, they burn the high priest's house down. They burn the palace of Bernice, who's the sister of Agrippa. They burn Agrippa's palace, or they try to anyway. And then they go to the archive building where all of the documents are stored on who owes what to who and who's got what title of deed to who and who owes what money to who. And they burn the archives. so that no one will now know who has deeds of property, thinking all the poor people are going to get on our side now. And so they burn the archives, and they try to kill Agrippa. They try to kill the high priest. They hold up in Agrippa's palace. They take the Antonia fortress over the next 2 days. They drive the Roman garrison out, and then as they attack that place. And so now those zealots who are on the Temple Mount, more guys are joining them because they look like they're winning. And so you have these zealots under Eleazar holding onto the Temple Mount, and that's all going on. And one of the zealots, a guy named Manahem, he sneaks off with some dudes, and he goes to the Masada. You've probably all heard of Masada, where a Roman fortress was. And he drives the Roman fortress out of there, and he gets all of the arms that are there, all the swords and the arrows and the spears and the siege engines. He brings them back to Jerusalem, and now as he's coming back to Jerusalem, he recruits a little army. So now you've got Manahem who's there, and he's like an army inside Jerusalem, with another army in Jerusalem and Agrippa's forces in Jerusalem. And so he decides he's going to make himself the king of Jerusalem. And so he does. He is able to capture the high priest and his brother, and he executes them. He executes the high priest and his brother, and he's acting like he's all powerful. Eleazar's like, dang, this is not what we set out to do. And we're going to have a tyrant. It sure doesn't want to be this guy. So Manahem comes to make sacrifice, sort of like a mafia guy going to a baby christening, isn't it? Right? What mafia guys doing in church? Why are they going to mass? And so Manahem comes with all of his soldiers to offer sacrifice to God, and Eleazar and his guys turn on him, capture him, torture him, and kill him. And so he's back in control again. And Eleazar is sitting there like, okay, we're in charge of this. And Agrippa still has a handful of Roman soldiers who are hanging out with him in his palace protecting him. And so they make a deal with Eleazar. They say, okay, there's a lot of you and a few of us. You win. We're not going to be able to resist. But rather than tear everything down and burn it down, maybe we can make a little truce between us. And Eleazar agrees to a truce. He says, okay, lay down your arms, and you guys can exit the city. No problem. You got safe passage. Just lay down your arms. Surrender the fortress to us. And so they make that agreement. And the Roman soldiers lay down their arms, and as they're exiting the city, Eleazar and his guys slaughter them all. And it's on a Sabbath day. It's on a Sabbath day. So Josephus is like, you can see that what's happening is all of the belief in God, the rituals of God, the worship of God, the sanctity of God's holy place, the sanctity of God's holy word is being violated left and right and left by these wicked Jewish people. And if you're a normal Jewish person trying to do it right, you are caught up in this maelstrom. You're caught up in this storm. The day on that Sabbath day, the day they slaughter them, something else happens on the same exact day. Caesarea, which has been having the fight and the battle going on, and Florus has skipped town. Since there's nobody in charge anymore, there's no Roman soldiers, the Jews and the Greeks inside that town fight each other, and the handful of soldiers that are in there join the Greek side. That same day that Eleazar killed the Roman soldiers, 20,000 Jews are killed in Caesarea, and the ones left alive are taken and sold into slavery, most of them sold into slavery in the galley ships. Also on the same day, when word gets out about this, news that the Jews were killed in Caesarea, all the Jews up in Phoenicia, Galilee, and Syria start to get angry, and they start killing the Greeks in their towns. And so now the Jews are fighting the Greeks in all the little towns and villages across Galilee and across Syria, and it's happening. And so they start fighting back. There's panic, there's hatred. Syria leads into almost full-scale war between all Jews and Greeks. And Josephus says this, the disorders in all Syria were terrible, and every city was divided into two armies and camped one against another. And the preservation of the one party as in the destruction of the other. So the daytime was spent in shedding of blood, and the night in fear, which was of the two more terrible. For when the Syrians thought they had ruined the Jews, they had the Judaizers in suspicion also. And as such, each side did not care to slay those whom they only suspected on the other. So did they greatly fear them when they were mingled together. Moreover, greediness of gain was a provocation to kill the opposite party, even to such as had of old appeared very mild and gentle towards them. For they, without fear, plundered the effects of the slain and carried off the spoils of those whom they slew in their own houses, as if they had been gained in a set battle, and he was esteemed a man of honor who got the greatest share, as having prevailed over the greatest number of his enemies. It was then common to see cities filled with dead bodies still lying unburied, and those of the old men mixed with infants, all dead and scattered about together. Women also lay amongst them without any covering for their nakedness. You might then see the whole province full of inexpressible calamities. All across Galilee and Judea and Phoenicia and Syria, Jews start fighting Greeks, Greeks start fighting Jews. And imagine it's like there's no holds barred. It's like picture your neighbor's house. If like, I want to go up to the South Hill on High Drive, I could just kick the door in, kill who's ever there, and take whatever I want. That's what was happening. Nobody was going to stop them. And so this old battle is already breaking out. There's a city called Scythopolis, which is halfway between Jerusalem and Galilee. And that city, the Jews were like, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't want this. We've been living in this hometown a long time. And you guys and we have gotten along. There's no fight between us. Let's keep our hometown pure. Let's not do this in our hometown. The Greeks that are in there agree. Yeah, we won't do this because we need to protect each other. That kind of thing's going on. But the citizens are like, however, this has gotten out of hand. We're a little scared. So maybe you Jewish people could pack up for a day or two. You go out to this Olive Garden out here, and you camp out there for a couple days until things calm down and we're making sure we're safe. And the Jews are like, that's reasonable. We're going to get along. We're going to avoid this problem. So they sneak a bunch of their people out there. They go to sleep that night. The Greeks sneak out of the city and slit all their throats. 13,000 Jews are killed that night in that city. And of course, all their goods are plundered and taken away. Meanwhile, down in Alexandria, Egypt, same thing. Greeks and the Jews have long had a battle with each other. That day, a battle breaks out. The Romans side with the Greeks. 50,000 Jews are killed in the city of Alexandria. The Romans haven't even really showed up yet. Think about that. We always think, the Romans showed up and annihilated the Jews. It's like, oh no. This was chaos and mayhem and violence and dread and thieving and plundering and raping and pillaging at a massive scale across the entire region. And everybody was doing, once no holds barred, it's like, who wants to kill who and take their stuff? Nobody's going to stop you. That's what was going on. There are only a handful of cities that did not have this happen. Antioch, Sidon, Gerasene, and a town called Apamea. The first three cities had a huge Christian population. Isn't that interesting? They're the only cities where this didn't happen during this time. The Romans aren't even in the fight yet. Finally, Cestius, who's up in Syria, he's like, remember, he's the big dog of all the stuff. He's like, okay, I got to intervene. This has gotten out of hand. He's stationed there with the 12th Legion. So he marches the 12th Legion down out of Damascus. And I don't know why that one doesn't come up. There we go. Comes down out of Damascus, which is the largest city in the region. It's the New York of the area, right? So he's coming down, and he's got this legion, and he marches down to Galilee, and all along the way, he burns every single Jewish town he finds and kills everybody in it. On his whole way down, he marches through Galilee all the way to Caesarea, killing and burning every Jewish town there is that as he comes across. Now, the moderate Jews who didn't want to have a fight, didn't want to get into this battle, didn't want this to happen, see this go down, and they're like, we have to pick a side. And so now the moderate Jews join the rebellion. So he marches all the way to Jerusalem, and he gets into the outer city, right there. You see that ring around the outer city, that new neighborhood is called the New City? He gets there. And he's able to he's inside that first wall, and you can see there's a couple more walls before you can reach the temple. He's there with the 12th Legion, and for some reason, no one knows, he just goes away. He packs his stuff up. Instead of attacking more, he just packs his stuff up and goes away. Josephus says his top officers had been paid off by Florus not to fight. And so they gave him bad advice, but no one knows for sure. However, he goes away, he takes his troops, and marches back to Damascus. And the whole way on the way back to Damascus, the Jews come out of the city, out of the countryside, out of the villages, those who had run away, and attack his troops, killing thousands of his Roman soldiers all the way back to Damascus. This is when ancient historians, Eusebius and others, tell us the Christians who were left in Jerusalem bugged out. All the Christians who were in Jerusalem at that time, after Cestius left with his Roman army, are like, hey, didn't Jesus tell us when we see this to bug out? And so they grab their stuff and poof, they're gone. Prophets are prophesying about it. No Christians are left in Jerusalem. That's when all the Christians bugged out. Meanwhile, all the Jews start flocking to Jerusalem because they're realizing this is going to get bad, and I want to be in the big city when the siege comes. And so they all start flocking to it. Back in Rome, word comes of, oh my God, all this mayhem's happening over there in the Palestinian area. What are we going to do? Nero is freaked out. He's got, if there's unrest that's going to happen there, other parts are going to blow up too. So Nero is freaked out. So he has Vespasian and his son Titus. He appoints Vespasian as his new general and Titus his son. And they grab the 10th, the 5th, the 12th, and the 15th Legion, and they march on Israel. They march on Judea. While they're marching on Judea, the city is being held by three different factions of Jewish people. The temple is held by, of course, Eleazar and his zealots. There's this crazy guy named John of Giscala, who I'd love to tell you more stories about, but there's no time. He's the worst of them all. And then another guy has emerged out of the woodwork named Simon of Georia, and the Jewish people who are seeing the fight between John and Eleazar and all the battle going ahead invited him into the city to kind of like put things to rate, and he's just another villain. So now Jerusalem's held by three different villains who are constantly fighting each other. And they're fighting each other so much that they actually burn all the grain stores that were held up in Jerusalem, which would have had the city survive for years. But since the grain stores got burnt, the city would only survive 1 year when the siege came. And most of the people would die of famine, to the point where their houses were so full of dead bodies that when the Romans finally conquered, they didn't even want to go into the house. So Vespasian, Titus, Agrippa sends troops. Nero's there. Nero will end up, before the war is over, Nero will commit suicide. And then there's all this mayhem back in Rome, and Vespasian's like, I got to get back to Rome, kick some butt and take some names, until he emerges as emperor. So he leaves Titus in charge. And so they march on, let me see where they march on Galilee. They take Galilee. They start burning all the cities, taking the towns. That's where he meets Josephus. Meanwhile, inside the city of Jerusalem, the Jews are fighting each other all the time. Constantly, these three different factions, raping, pillaging, plundering, going to anybody's house they can. And while they're up there conquering Galilee, the Jewish people are like, hey, we need help. The normal people are like, we need serious help here. This thing is in disarray. And so they decide, let's get a team of dudes to go down to the Idumeans and get their help. Now, the Idumeans are the descendants of Esau, twin brother of Jacob. They're not Jews, but they're from the line of Abraham. And some time ago, they had been converted to Judaism, so they were all like in with the temple. And so they say, we need to get guys down there. And so what they do is they say, let's send a team down there to get the Idumeans. And they were trying to negotiate with Eleazar, who held the Temple Mount. And the guy they decide they're going to pick to be the negotiator is this guy, John of Giscala, who's a rogue and a cutthroat and a murderous guy and only out for himself. And so he goes in there, instead of negotiating, he tells them the plan. And so they go, what should we do? What should we do? They're going to get the Idumeans. And John says, you get messengers to them first. And so they send messengers out first, and they reach the Idumeans first. Let me see. You can see the Idumeans are down there below Judea. And the next day, the Idumeans march on Jerusalem with an army 20,000 strong. And the normal citizens bar the gates and are like, what are you doing? We're coming to deliver the temple. We're going to set the temple free because you guys are trying to turn the city over to the Romans. And they're like, no, that's not us. The dudes who got the temple are the problem. And the Idumeans and them argue back and forth, and they can't come to any kind of understanding of what's going on. Well, if you were innocent, you wouldn't have closed the gates on us. Well, if you didn't show up with an army, we wouldn't have closed the gates. And so this whole argument starts happening, and that night, the Idumeans camp down, and one of the worst storms in the history of Israel takes place. A massive rain and wind and thunderstorm. It uproots whole olive groves. The windstorm is so strong. The Idumeans have to hunker down under their shields. And the guards who are on the temple walls are told, get inside, go to bed. Nothing's going to happen tonight. You're going to get blown off the wall. This is like a hurricane force that's going through. And while that's happening, then, Eleazar and his little group see their opportunity, and they're holding the Temple Mount. They sneak down during the storm, and they saw the wood that's holding the gates together, and they open the gates, and no one even hears the sound because the storm is so great. They go out to the Idumeans who think they're going to be attacked. Oh, no. And they sneak into the city during the storm, and they begin going throughout where all the guards are asleep, slitting all their throats. And then the Idumeans march all the way up to the Temple Mount, killing, fighting as they go, and they get to the Temple Mount, and then they start fighting their way all the way back down, and before the day is done, they will kill 12,000 people in the city. And when it's all said and done, the new high priest, they kill him. Eleazar and his guys, they decide we need a new high priest. They're going to pick a new family line. They cast lots for who the high priest should be. The lot falls to this clan, then to this tribe, this clan, this family, on down the line. And the guy who gets selected by lot is mentally handicapped. He doesn't even know what the high priest is. You see the judgment of God all over this thing, right? And so now they kill the Idumeans. As soon as the daylight sort of breaks, Eleazar and all of his group, and John Agiscalo is holding it, they start grabbing all of the rich people of the city and putting them on mock trial and having them executed. And the Idumeans go, wait a minute, this isn't what we said we were going to do. And then one of the guys says, yeah, we had you. We lied. And the Idumeans go, oh, man, we've been lied to. They pack up and flee the city and just leave. First opening the prisons and letting out 2,000 prisoners. And then after the Idumeans go, most of the soldiers have now been killed by the Idumeans. So Eleazar and John of Giscol and all their dudes have free reign, and they start killing and slaughtering more people. Titus hasn't even shown up yet. Romans haven't even shown up yet. When Titus finally comes, he besieges the city. He goes through and takes the new city, and then he takes the Antonia fortress, and then he takes it by building a ramp up there. There was this pool that was there, and they build a ramp up there. That's the weak spot in the wall. Marches up that ramp, and then over a few days, he'll take the temple, first the outer court, and then he'll take the inner court, and then the whole thing gets set on fire, and he tries to put the fire out, and then he finally attacks into the inner temple where all the guys are holding out. That's the temple that he would destroy. It would look something like that. Here's what's weird. At every turn, when he would take a spot, he would stop and say, all right, let's negotiate a peace treaty. You can see you're not going to win, so let's stop this. And the Jews wouldn't stop. So he took the Antonia fortress. Okay, you can see I'm about to win, so let's put a stop to this. And they wouldn't stop. And then he was taking the temple outer courts. All right, let's put a stop to this, negotiate a treaty. And they wouldn't stop. Interesting is, he didn't want the temple to burn. To Titus, having the temple was prestige. It meant, look at the glorious cities Rome controls. To destroy the temple was like, this is bad. If we destroy this temple, then we've got rubble. And he was a little superstitious too. He didn't want to destroy temples. So the temple catches on fire. He sends his soldiers to put the fire out. And the Jews fight them, beat them back so much that they can't put the fire out. And the temple burns down. And the Romans are unable to save it. Until they're finally like, well, we can't save this thing. Let's burn it all down to the ground. And then after he takes the temple, that little bridge there that's in the middle going across to the upper city, he stands on that bridge to the remaining citizens in the upper city. He says, please, it's time to surrender. They still won't surrender. And so he marches into the upper and lower cities and turns his soldiers loose, slaughtering. So many people were killed in that slaughter. The blood flowed down from the upper city down into the lower city and put out fires where the houses were on fire. I mean, you talk about a hideous slaughter. So much blood had flowed off the Temple Mount during that previous battle there that blood flowed over the walls of the Temple Mount down onto the streets below. Can you imagine seeing the Western Wailing Wall, blood flowing down off of it? This is what was happening. And so the whole thing, then they finally set their standards up after it all said and done, and the temple's destroyed, and they worshiped and burnt to their standards. And most of it in my life, I've heard Christian pastors say, that's the abomination that causes desolation in a sanctuary. They set their standards up, and they worshiped them. And Jesus said, when you see that, flee the city. Well, when you see that, it's too late to flee the city. It is over by then. And so that's the way I've always heard it. So maybe something else is the abomination that causes desolation. Josephus says it's when they slaughtered the priests in the temple and killed them all and killed the high priest in the temple. That's when the abomination happened. And it was other Jews who did that. It wasn't the Romans who did that. Titus would march home to Rome, put up the Titus arch, still there today. And you can see on the inside panel where they caught the large candlestick that they took out of the sanctuary. That arch is still there today. So I look at this whole thing and I think, that was awful. Colossally corrupt, hugely stupid, violent, brutal. Every wanton impulse of any vile person was just rape, pillage, plunder, death, murder, execution, friends turning on friends, homes being destroyed. The Romans hadn't even shown up and this was going on, and Jesus is saying that's what the end times will be like. That's what the end times will be like when I come back. Now that shocks me. That's like, oh. Jesus is saying, then you'll see the Son of Man coming. Like, whatever had happened in Rome is what it's going to be like here. Paul would write to the Thessalonian church. Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. And the man of sin, or lawlessness is a better word, will be revealed. The son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshiped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Titus didn't do that. He didn't do that. That's still somebody yet to come. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. What's restraining? Who's restraining? Something is holding all that evil in check right now and preventing it from happening. Who is he that's restraining? What is restraining the evil? For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. I would submit to you that restraining is one of two things: the church or the Holy Spirit himself. I'm currently leaning to the Holy Spirit because it's masculine. Church is usually feminine, the bride. Or it could be both, since the Holy Spirit inhabits the church. And what is restraining society from going totally evil and corrupt is the Holy Spirit inside the lives of godly people now, immersed and sprinkled throughout society. Have you ever thought of what would happen if all Christians disappeared from America? I mean, most people think, yeah, churches would be empty. Do you know how much nonprofit work would end? Do you know how many hospitals and orphanages and old folks' homes would be abandoned? Do you know how many medical workers would be gone? Do you know how many teachers would disappear? Do you know how many? I mean, the vast majority of nonprofit work working with homeless and impoverished and single moms is done by Christians. After all, I've said it before, go to any city and find the hospital started by atheists. You won't find one. They were all started by Christians, right? Universities. Guess who started universities? Christians started universities, right? Now, they're all probably corrupt now, but Christians started them, that whole idea. Imagine all Christians removed from society. He that restrains would let society just run amok. Would it turn into what happened in the days when the Jews were destroyed? So I would say this. No matter what happens in the world, no matter what happens in our lives, no matter what happens in politics or who gets elected to what, we hold on to Jesus. Jesus is our hope. Jesus is our answer. Paul would say to his protege Timothy, in the last days, men will be corrupt. They will turn arrogant and pompous, and they will look out. They'll be lovers of greed and haters of good. That's what they'll be like. What do? We hang on to Jesus. We say, no matter what goes on, I'm going to grab Jesus by the hem of his garment, and I'm going to hold on as tight as I can for open and healing. And whatever goes on in society, my trust is not in politics. My trust is not in law enforcement. My trust is not in the educational system. My trust is not in any news media. My trust is not in any of that. My trust is in Jesus. Amen. And when I hold on to Jesus, it's going to all be okay for me. And Jesus has promised he'll take care of his own. He'll take care of his kids. Will the church be here when all of that goes on, or will the church be gone? I believe it'll be gone, and I'll tell you why next week. And I'll prove it to you next week. Stand with me and let's pray. Lord, I confess that sometimes I have prayed, I wish you would come and judge the wicked and judge this wicked world and destroy what is evil. I get irritated, I get aggravated, I get angry at the wickedness I see in this world. And yet, when I read in times of history where your grace finally reached its limits, and vengeance and justice and wrath were poured out, those times were horrible. And I can see and understand why you hold off and you wait with incredible patience so that one more person would come to know you, so that someone else could be saved, so that someone else could hear of your salvific gospel, which will transform a life, and wrath will not be poured out on them, but they would be rescued instead. And I understand your long suffering, because the judgment of evil is a dark and insidious thing that will happen. And I know you don't want to do it. Your word says, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked. And so, Lord, please help all of us to know that if the time is short and you're coming soon, and these days are going to happen within our lifetimes, will you give us the power and the strength and the courage to make a difference in your name? Will you allow us to spread your word and your gospel and let others be saved from the wrath that is to come, rescued from all of that? Lord, will you allow us to hold on tight to you and bring as many others with us before it's our turn to go? This we pray in your holy and powerful and precious name. Amen. All right, next week, will the church be here or not?